Good afternoon. My name is Valentina de Riso, and welcome to the second panel of our Building Bridges conference. I'm delighted to chair this panel and to have the opportunity to hear about different ways of thinking about identity, diaspora, and dispossession, but also community. Each speaker will deliver their paper after my introduction, and there will be time for discussion and questions at the end of the session after all the papers have been delivered. Our first presenter is Isabel Arce Zelada. Isabel is a PhD student at the University of Hull, studying asylum in the UK, particularly the impacts on identity and transmission for those who go through it. Labeled as an alien for 18 years, embodying the border and violence perpetuated throughout Latin America, and an heir to displacement, they are comfortable in unbelonging. Their paper is titled Alienhoods, The Spaces Beyond Citizenship, and deals with the structure of citizenship and how it is viewed from the perspective of alienhoods. The second paper is co-authored by Rajbir, Samal, and Binod Mishra. Rajbir Samal, who presents today, is a PhD research scholar at the Department of Humanities and Social Sciences at the Indian Institute of Technology in Roorkee, India. He is currently working on his thesis, Mapping the Culinary, Contesting Food and Identity in Select South Asian Diasporic Fiction. Binod Mishra is a professor of English at the Department of Humanities and Social Sciences in Roorkee, India. It has many research articles and edited volumes to his name. His recently published edited volume, Kaku in Crisis, brings together quintessential voices of 25 women poets from India and abroad. Rajbir Samal will present the paper today titled Reimagining the Kitchen Indians, Engendering the Discourses of Nation, Culture and Community, looking at how the geographic displacement of diasporic Indians produces anxieties to reproduce the authenticity of Indianness through multifarious culinary performances. Our third presenter is Ghosun Baaqeel. Ghosun holds a master's degree in English literature and postcolonial studies from the University of Kent in the UK and a master's degree in art from Arkansas State University in the US. She has previously worked as an English teacher at several schools in Saudi Arabia and is currently a lecturer in English literature at Taif University in Saudi Arabia. She's also working on her PhD in English and related literature at the University of York in the UK. Her interests and areas of research include globalism, postcolonialism, and double consciousness in Iraqi poetry. Her paper today is titled Unveiling Double Consciousness and Unsettling Hegemonic Economies in Iraqi free verse poetry. Ghosun explores a form of Arabic free verse poetry in response to ongoing interference and manipulation of Iraq's national and economic interests by Western hegemonic forces, focusing on how Arabic free verse poetry is used to critique a problematic Du Boisian double consciousness as an expression of Iraqi identity. We conclude our panel with a paper by Victoria Chang. Victoria currently holds a BA and MA in Literatures in English from the University of the West Indies, St. Augustine, Trinidad and Tobago. She's a full-time PhD Literatures in English candidate at that institution and works as an academic tutor in the Literary, Cultural and Communication Studies department. Her research interests pertain to issues of gender, identity, culture, and ethnicity, as well as nationhood. Her thesis focuses on literary representations of female Indo-Trinidadian identities in the novel form. Her paper is titled Bonds Beyond Boundaries in Shani Mutu's He Drowned She in the Sea. It interrogates notions of space, place, and landscape for their impact on an association with identity formation and articulation in Indo-Trinidadian and Canadian writer Shani Mutu's He Drowned She in the Sea. Please join me in welcoming our panelists. I hope we can have a lively discussion and question and answers after we listen to the presentations. So please submit your questions in the live chat function as you listen, or send them by email to the address buildingbridges@ntu.ac.uk. Thanks very much again, and enjoy these great papers.
Thank you for having me. My name is Isabel. I'm in my second year of PhD studies. I popped in my email and my Twitter handle right here if anyone has any questions or thoughts or clarifications, or would want to just share some things that they might be working on, or want to collaborate on anything, give me a shout. I am currently trying to conduct my fieldwork and trying to just decipher things around asylum narratives and the colonial violence reproduced in the UK asylum court system. So this is part of that discussion, that kind of deciphering. This presentation is going to talk about the concept of alienhoods and the inclusion of existences beyond citizenship. And the first instance in which I used alienhood was in trying to conceptualize what the opposite experience from the experience of a citizen is. But of course, as is the case with most terms in academia, alienhood had already been established by Marciniak, who is defining alienhood as a highly racialized, rhetorical, and disciplinary apparatus that classifies immigrants, refugees, and border crossers in relation to the US territory, but also a term that works in conjunction with legitimation and functions as a conceptual apparatus that holds the exilic self within its parameters and discursively stamps the foreigner's body. It simultaneously stamps the symbolic identity of the nation. So alienhood itself is not only the idea of the other, but it's also the machinations between alienhood and legitimation that establishes the alien, but also the nation. She links this alienhood closely to the social perception of aliens being both undesirable migrants and being portrayed in cinema as literal space aliens, such as Men in Black. She also warns people of trying to expand the term outside of the US territories. However, as someone who is based in the UK, I have to say that alienhood itself needs to be part of a wider dialogue. Yes, we must acknowledge that we don't use the term alien as much as the US. Illegality and bogus migration are used much more often in everyday discussions, but what we must also acknowledge is that the construction of the alien opposition to the citizen came from a long legal history in English law. The Alien Acts were designed to designate who was a citizen, who was not. They were also designed to keep dangerous people outside the imaginary nation-ruler relationship so as to not change the public opinion of the ruling entity at the time. So we see this in the Aliens Act of 705, in which we talk a lot about the Scottish threat within the English legal system and how that could be neutralized, and how the borders between Scotland and England should simultaneously also be neutralized in that process, right? And even though we all are very much aware that that animosity might not necessarily have stopped in 705, it was one of those critical points of trying to establish a British identity. And the Aliens Act of 792-3 was dealing with the French Revolution and the fear of introducing revolutionaries into British soil that could then transform the public opinion of the ruler. But even after that fear had subsided and the French Revolution was no longer deemed a threat, the Alien Office that had been established during that time, which was designed to keep records of those entering the country, was dismantled, effectively leaving Britain without migration regulation and almost open borders. But the Alien Acts aren't just historical relics in English law. They are part of the citizenship laws that mirrors the logic of eugenics, and have since the early 20th century been renewed and incorporated into our nationality and citizenship laws. In 1905, we see the blatant mention of desirable and undesirable migrants. The undesirable migrant is the one that could not support themselves or their dependents, those classified as lunatics or idiots, and those who were classified to have a disease or condition that would make them a public dependent, or those who have been convicted for a non-political crime in a country with an extradition treaty with Britain. So we see here already the creation of the undesirable migrant, which is riddled with ableist rhetorics, and also the criminal alien that then becomes extraditable. That means, potentially deportable, which is still something we see to this day. This particular act, the 1905 Act, saw at least 1,378 Jewish people deported, and the number of Jewish refugees being taken in dropped from 500 in 1906 to 5 in 1910. While the act itself did not mention Jewish people specifically, it was lobbied through Parliament after years of anti-Semitic protests by the ruling class and working class of Britain alike. The British Brothers League spent years trying to prove that Jewish people in Christian lands would never be successful. They argued this after so-called research that had been conducted in Eastern Europe and published in a book called The Alien Immigrant. Jewish trade unionists argued back for their rights, trying to set the facts straight about Jewish migration to Britain in publications such as A Voice from the Aliens. The 1905 Act also criminalized whoever aided the aliens' journey to Britain, threatening with a fine or making them responsible for transporting them back. Here's where we see the starting of the criminalization of those who try and help people make dangerous journeys across borders. The immigrant who was caught as being undesirable within British territories would be tried under the Vagrancy Act of 1824, earning them up to 3 months in jail. It's the same Vagrancy Act that criminalized homeless people and poor people and sex workers in Britain. In 1914, the Alien Act created even more divides within the British citizenship, stating that naturalized citizens could be stripped of their citizenship for various forms of treasons. 12-month criminal sentence, spending more than 7 years outside of British territories, or a reason as vague as not being of good character at the time of naturalization. The 1914 Act also established the signing in of aliens who were over 16. A signing in we still see from people who are under immigration authorities and not currently in detention, making the deportation more effective and enabling the monitoring of foreigners who were at this point feared to be the enemy aliens coming to infiltrate Britain during the war. However, the signing in also affected those who were deemed undesirable aliens who were also deported from Britain during wartime. The 1919 Act reinstated the 1914 Act to continue after the wartime was over, and criminalized the act of stating falsehoods as an immigrant, punished by up to 3 months with or without hard labor. By creating this criminal alien, British subjects who were not by law classified as aliens became seen as aliens by their white counterparts. So Asian British workers were discriminated against in the workplace by being put below white British workers in a racialized hierarchy. The 1914 Act has been renewed consistently until the substantial 1971 Immigration Act that is still cited today in immigration decisions. It also appears in the new Nationality and Border Bill that Priti Patel has proposed by taking the definition of alien and citizen in order to premise it from the beginning. The terminology of alien might not be a cinematic tool in Britain, but it is a substantial historical term and affects our contemporary immigration regulations and imaginaries about the immigrant. In order to tie the internal British immigration laws with the British colonization around the world, we must first talk about what colonial violence is and how it is defined. Here's a comparison between Fanon's stages of colonial violence and Warrior Publication's stages of colonial violence. Warrior Publication is an indigenous publication for Turtle Island. Both include 4 stages, but have differences in how they conceptualize colonial violence. Fanon starts with the forceful arrival settlement with an extractivist agenda, while Warrior Publication does not emphasize arrival or even settling as the starting point, but rather the active decision of mapping out territories and going on exploratory missions in order to subjugate. Those missions would now be called voyages of explorations or scientific discoveries, but not necessarily recon missions for colonial endeavors, which is what they actually were. The second stage for Fanon is the displacement of indigenous hierarchies by implementing the colonizers' hierarchies above them. So we don't see a disappearance of indigenous hierarchies or an eradication of them, but we do see the colonizing hierarchies utilizing them in a sort of parasitic way to implement laws and enable extraction. From Warrior Publication, we see the invasion period, which is a period of armed conflict between indigenous nations and the colonial forces. The third stage of Fanon is the colonized hierarchy is portrayed as more civilized, while the displaced colonized hierarchical structure is labeled as a wild, savage, and uncivilized structure, which is why they need this parasitical structure on top of them to civilize them, right? So they position those under the archetype of colonized as monitoring, taming, and civilizing the indigenous nations. Whereas in work publication, this is the stage of occupation, one in which indigenous nation is defeated and subjugated through the establishment of a colonial government that enslaves and displaces the indigenous population. Fanon's last and final stage, which is the fourth stage, is establishing the creation of the colonized hierarchical system through institutions. So economic, political, blah, blah, asylum is part of that institution. Whereas for work publication, assimilation is the fourth stage, so the one in which physical destruction and biological warfare achieves enough the population to actually indoctrinate surviving natives into the European system, and also the separation of indigenous youth from their people being part of the assimilation process and that colonial violence. So both speak of the establishment of institutions to recreate the colonizing system that governs the indigenous nations, while also describing the violence that this entails physically, environmentally, and relationally between families and communities. Visually, colonization will be displacing the indigenous hierarchies by parasitically attaching itself to its categorizing mechanism, translating its terminologies and hierarchical positions into the colonizing system through the justification of civilizing. The citizenship structure we are then left with is one that is reliant on the theft of other territories. The British colonialism was in part born out of great necessity from the farming population in Britain that had been displaced by commercial growing of sheep and had a shortage of land in which to farm food. There were also questions of religious populations moving for other reasons, as we all know. The mismanagement of their territories was then solved by sending their subjects overseas to promise lands that were not Britain's to promise. On the back of displaced indigenous nations and the subjugation of territory, the citizenship system had to be developed to secure the resources being extracted, but also to give the authority to different people to colonize in the name of a nation. As civil rights grew and more people were included as citizens, such as women and Black and brown people, the idea that the citizen was merely the person who had a relationship with the nation state has obscured how the citizen had always been designed to be the white colonizing male. However, everyone else being an afterthought and one that was not represented systematically nor by the government, the ruling power seems to have become a back burner question. The alien served to demarcate the limits of citizenship and to produce a sense of fear of what was beyond citizenship. In order to naturalize a stateless alien, they would have to be categorized into the alien categories that make citizenship different from one another, and then granted a citizenship that would always be more precarious than a natural-born non-alien race, non-alien religion, non-alien class citizen. In this sense, as Professor Katia Franco has stated, illegal becomes an ontological term, not only in the imaginary of the citizen, but also in the embodiment of the illegalized, alienized person that is put on trial for crossing borders. Alienhoods then also describes the ontological state created by the legalization of the crossing of borders, turning some people into aliens in relation to the nation state that they entered. This state is born out of wartime logic of security, recon, and treason. When the UK legal conception of aliens was then used in the US, it also birthed an imagination linking actual outer space aliens with immigrants. But that does not mean that alienhood does not exist in Britain, or that it didn't spring from a long legal history of war and citizenship. Alienhood and cosmopolitanism reinforce each other in revealing how easily one moves within the system and how many alternative ways that the other needs to find in order to move in similar ways. What I was trying to illustrate is how the alliance between certain nation states transforms mobility of the cosmopolitan citizen, enacting no change on their personhood as they cross the border, while the non-cosmopolitan citizen is highlighted as a potential alien or security threat, making their mobility a threat, transforming them every time they encounter a border. The legal system of asylum functions to objectify the stateless alien into alienized categories in order to allow them into the citizenship system. Here's where we find narrative inequalities in which the person being put on trial for crossing a border is assumed to be lying, an assumption that comes from the threat of infiltration and recon missions, but are being translated into the asylum system of today and marketed as a humanitarian system that wants to support the true or real refugee. By translating the person's narrative and subjectification, we find the same parasitic structure as the one that colonial violence creates in territories on an individual basis. This again reproduces how alienhood is used to create different experiences of the citizenship system and exclude people fully from its benefits. Even if accepted into the structure, they will have to find other means in order to be supported, enabling an entire, although overworked, charity sector to try and remedy the constant colonizing violence that exits the nation state into other territories, but is also utilized on people entering the nation state when escaping the colonial violence in their territories. Thank you for listening to me. I hope that made some sense. If not, feel free to ask me all the questions you want. Yeah, if you want any further clarifications, any further questions or anything, don't hesitate to give me a shout. Thank you.
Hello everyone, I am Rajbir Samal, research scholar at the Department of Humanities and Social Sciences, IIT Roorkee, India. The topic that I am going to present is on Reimagining the Kitchen Indians, engendering the discourses of nation, culture and community. Before going on to the central idea of my presentation, let us just understand the interconnection between food and diaspora. Food is the most significant medium between inside and outside of our bodies, operates one of the key cultural signs that structure people's sense of the self and their identities. Although banal practices of everyday life, the preparation and consumption of food have far-reaching significance in the subject formation of people. Therefore, when people cross their national boundaries and enter unfamiliar territories, the acts of cooking and eating become one of the most significant and meaningful exercises. For the diasporic population, these acts are inextricably entangled with their experiences and dilemmas of identity. Anita Manor, one of the key food theorists, notes that food as a central part of the cultural imagination of diasporic populations becomes one of the most viable and visible sites both to affirm and resist notions of home and belonging. As such, food has always been a central route to read and understand the nations of homeland and hostland in relation to diasporic identities. It also signals the multiple ways in which food is connected to these discursive formations of diasporic identities. Now let us come to the central argument of my presentation, engendering food, nation and culture. As classical diasporic theories suggest, diaspora encapsulates a sense of displacement and disposition of immigrants. And this displacement necessarily evokes a desire of connecting to the homeland by some way or the other. The geographic displacement of diasporic Indians also engender a desire to connect to the lost homeland. So for diasporic Indians, homeland is codified through different tangible and intangible cultural practices by which they can reproduce Indianness in the foreign land. But one interesting thing here is that Indianness that the immigrants desire to reproduce has an unchanging cultural essence which can be easily produced through culinary practices. In simple terms, the conditions of becoming diasporic or living diasporically produce a fundamental longing for Indian comestibles. But the reproduction of Indian identity has a gender logic to it, that the female Indian immigrants in the diaspora should be responsible for the faithful reproduction of Indianness. Women, as the custodians of Indian tradition, should preserve the cultural distinctiveness of Indian culture. Diasporic women are often wedded to the belief that the faithful reproduction of national culture takes place in the culinary sphere. As Indian wives, mothers, and daughters, they should keep that Indianness strongly rooted through the food they cook and they feed. Anita Manor again here notes that gender roles continue to be implicated in the scripts of women's nationalisms and cultural identities, particularly as they take root in the culinary realm. So the women of the diaspora are unproblematically assigned with the task of maintaining the national cultural identities. It also suggests another aspect of diasporic women that they are most frequently and also problematically positioned within the domestic cultural economy, as most of their culinary activities fall within the domestic kitchen. So they are assigned with the task of maintaining the edifice of home that becomes synonymous with Indian culture. The honors of protecting and preserving the edifice of home being assigned to women can be alluded to the 19th century Indian nationalist movement. Partho Chatterjee, in his influential essay, The Nationalist Resolution of Women's Question, has argued that the home was the principal site expressing the spiritual quality of the national culture, and women must take the main responsibility of protecting this quality. And extending my argument to the present study, domestic kitchen then becomes a space to produce an authentic version of Indianness, where diasporic women are made to play the role of bona fide brokers of Indian culture through their culinary acts. Apart from connecting the dislocated Indians with their national culture, these gender culinary rituals also become instrumental in building transnational communities in the coastline. Now, this is the second part of my argument where I try to connect women's culinary acts and the diasporic community. Through kitchen rituals, diasporic women serve a crucial role in building communities based on similar national belonging. As they are assigned with the role of producing authentic national food, their culinary performative roles are used as a medium to form a similarly authentic national community beyond the original national borders. The culinary logic of national origin helps in maintaining the coherence of diasporic community through shared meals of supposed authentic national dishes. So women's culinary rituals nurture the national belonging and belonging of the transnational community. As such, their culinary acts transform the family space and community space to the ideas of home and homeland. But another interesting aspect of culinary bonding in the diasporic community is that it can also act as the cultural borderline between the migrants and the host land. The culinary culture of a diasporic community can neatly evoke the cultural differences that they have with other communities and even demarcate the spatial and cultural lines of separateness. So the culinary customs of a community can play an important role in reconstructing the national border of the diasporic community. It also alludes to the immigrants' desire to occupy a safe space in the hostland. Is a response to the bitter tastes of racism and xenophobia that fall outside the community. So the culinary communities essentially serve as the geopolitical border to resist any infiltration of the host culture while producing a fertile site to foster transnational culture. Now coming to the text that I have taken, Anita and Me is the debut novel of Meera Syal, published in the year 1996. It is a semi-autobiographical novel based on Syal's childhood in the village of Essington. The novel is told from the perspective of Nina, a young British Indian girl growing up in the village of Tollington during 1960s. The plot of the novel centers around Mina's friendship with Anita Rooter that changes everything one summer as it transforms Mina from immaturity to a more acute awareness of society around her. Mina's experience is shown to be a product of social practices and social structures where race and cultural differentiation are key determinants. Besides raising question about the construction of childhood interaction, the novel explores several issues that beset the experiences of Indian immigrants living in Britain. First, it deconstructs how racism impacts upon the experiences of a British Indian girl and her family in everyday life. It tries to show how circumscribed the characters' lives are by the mere fact of being a South Asian. And their lives are not only impacted on the basis of racial abuse only, but on the day-to-day basis, where race is a constant source of comment. Simple signifiers of clothes, food, and mannerism become important factors of cultural differences. The novel also focuses on the interaction within the community and how it shapes the lives of Indian immigrants. It also throws light on the gender nature of diaspora, both in the family space and in the community space. And the two other important axes that it deals with is childhood and intergenerational gap. Now, coming on to the aspect that I centrally focus on this presentation is kitchen Indians. And let us locate it in the text that I have taken. So, we previously discussed how women are assigned with the task of evoking and preserving national culture. So, they do so through multifarious ways, and it is done mainly through the culinary acts that they perform within the diasporic space. In the text, Anita and Me, Syal makes Diljit the prototype of an Indian woman who could keep the cultural distinctiveness of Indian culture intact by performing diverse culinary tasks. In the first chapter of the text, we find glimpses of that when Anita describes the demographics of their garden. Sorry, it is Meena. Meena describes the demographics of their garden. It is a sheer embarrassment for Meena that her mother Daljit grows herbs like dhania, translating to coriander, pudina, translating to mint, that are used to garnish Indian meals. But for Daljit, to grow and cook Indian food with all the extensive labor that comes with it is a way of connecting to the lost homeland. As Sayal notes, this food was not something to fill a hole, it was soul food. Further, her desire to pass on the culinary knowledge to Mina speaks of two important aspects of women and Indian culture. First, it shows the importance of women to perpetuate the culinary distinctiveness of Indian diaspora, which Daljit throughout the novel strives to maintain. Secondly, it alludes to the idiosyncratic relationship between women and Indian culture, where culinary skills are the prerequisite to getting married. Thus, this can be seen in the words of Daljit to Mina while persuading her to learn Indian cuisine. And I quote, "You are going to have to learn to cook if you want to get married, aren't you?" So these are the words that are spoken by Daljit to Mina, right? Now, speaking of the another aspect of Indian culinary culture is to assert Indian cultural identity in relation to British national identity. So when Anita Rooter is called for dinner to Mina's house, Daljit prepared two menus, one Indian and one British, and she makes sure that all the Indian food is lined before Mina, even though Mina is utterly baffled and chooses fish fingers and chips over Indian food. The entire intention of Daljit was to assert Indian identity before Anita Rooter, right? Uh, the labor-straining culinary tasks that Daljit, Sela Auntie, and other Indian immigrant women everyday work out is a medium to constantly reinforce their cultural identity and also to emphasize their roles as the cultural bearers of Indian culture. The situatedness of Indian diasporic women regularly carrying out culinary assignments and problematically occupying the space of kitchen is what made me to think of the title, that is Kitchen Indians, right? Diverging a little bit, I want to point out another very important aspect of culinary aspect of Indian communities, that it is through culinary preferences that racism is meted out to Indian immigrants. In the novel, after altercation with Anita, when Mina started getting demeaning notes, the content of one note is very intriguing. In the note, the sender tried to racialize Mina by trying to write chapati, scribbling 3 spellings of it, as you can see from the slide. So a culinary medium is adopted to express the terms of racism to Indian immigrants. And why I try to emphasize this fact is because it is because the racism is meted out to Indian immigrants, they try to form in a community through different cultural aspects, and food is one of the central tenet of that. In order to deal with this the state of racism and xenophobia, the diasporic Indians crave to form a community based on similar national belonging, which Anita Manor calls diasporic intimacy. So in the novel, it is no wonder that Mina and her family so often spend their time in a community space rather than with their actual neighbors. As Mina says, whenever we went out, all we do was to sit in each other's lounge, eat each other's food, and watch each other's television. My parents always wore their smartest clothes. So Mina and their family, Mina and her family always spend their space in the community space. So it also is a matter of amazement for Mina and English neighbors that though none of the members of the community is actually related to her by blood, they are still united as a big family. Mina calls this space Little India, as the uncles and the aunties in the community is connected by something stronger than the blood, that is by India. The building of community also gives rise to another aspect of maintaining the cultural borders of it. So women play a very crucial role in it. Their active participation in the family gatherings termed as mehfils in the novel attest to this very fact. As described in the novel, mehfils are actually family gatherings of Indian immigrants where they actively take part in the reproduction of Indian culture. Women play a central part in these mehfils as they churn out Indian dishes, authentic Indian dishes, and reinforce the structural workings of Indian culture. Where in the structural workings, women culinary rituals are squarely reserved for the women to perform. Describe one of the mehfils, Mina notes that my aunties had formed an assembly line with Mama at the head, who warmed up a chapati on the griddle before passing it down the the line on a plate onto which each auntie plunged a serving of meat, rice, vegetables, and yogurt straight into the waiting hands of the men. So these mehfils serve as the repertoire of Indian culture, where Indian immigrants can both produce and reproduce and exercise their cultural authenticity and also the structural underpinnings of Indian culture. These mehfils also essentially act as cultural borderlines that protect and preserve the cultural distinctiveness of the community and in extension of the nation. Now, moving ahead, community space also becomes an active site of pedagogical learning where children are taught to perform and embody Indian culture. In the text, Meena is taught to behave and work in a certain way by the community members. It is assumed to be the responsibility by the community members to transfuse Indian cultural values into the younger ones of the community. So when Daljit or the aunties reproaches Meena by saying, stand with your legs, why don't you grow your hair, or ask to help in the kitchen chores, these are considered to be the pedagogical lessons to be taught by the community members to the Indian girl, quote unquote Indian girl. Meena also notes scolding each other's kids was expected as a sign of affection almost, that you cared enough about them to administer a pinch or nudge now and then. It also shows how women take up the honors in the construction of a mythical unity of national imagined communities by both being culinary agents in the mehfils and pedagogical administrators. Thus, when Daljit is in the hospital, Mr. Wallace offered to help to set up a rota for taking care of the dietary needs of the Kumar family. Auntie Shaila outrightly rejects it by saying, don't worry, we'll see to that. So here we see how the community plays a role in the neat segregation of boundaries between Indian immigrants and British neighbors. For the maintenance of the boundaries, culinary preferences and differences are also constantly evoked by Indian women to demarcate between us, that is Indian immigrants, and them, British neighbors. Speaking of their culinary difference, Daljit and other aunties disapprovingly points out English culinary practices. Their intention can be sensed from these lines, like the way they wash up, they never rinse the soap of the dishes. Or I will never understand this about the English, all this popping up about being civilized with their cucumber sandwiches. So culinary becomes a central axis on which the cultural borders of a community is rested upon, and by corollary, women play instrumental roles in maintaining the borders. Now, coming to the conclusion of my presentation, we get from the study how culinary discourse is deeply encoded within the textual fabric of Indian diasporic literature. It sets the stage for an extensive discussion about intricate layering of food, culture, and nation. By bringing food as an axis of analysis into the novel, it becomes clear that how the formations of the ideas of nation and culture in the Indian diaspora are deeply gendered. Taking reference to Daljit, Auntie Sheila, and the other Indian immigrant women in the text, other Indian immigrants, the text shows that how Indian diaspora is heavily reliant on women to produce the authentic national culture. Indian women are wedded to the belief that the faithful reproduction of Indian culture involves in their preparation of authentic Indian cuisines at home and at the community space. Their culinary rituals are also employed to maintain cultural borders of the Indian community, which in turn provides a pedagogical space to transmit Indian cultural values. By reading the culinary customs of Indian community, by looking at the mehfils organized by Indian community, we also got to know the structural workings of gender relations which go beyond the national borders. This is the end of my presentation. Thank you.
Hello, everyone. This might be the first time you have come across the complexity of Iraqi history, its people, and poetry. Today, I'm only able to give you a glimpse of these, so I hope I whet your appetite enough to read my paper. Since the 1958 revolution that defeated its colonial oppressors, Iraq has continued to struggle to find its own cultural identity. In response to decolonization, the Iraqi poet Badr Shakir al-Sayyab, 1926 to 1964, a key founder of the Arabic free verse movement, wrote the poem The Blonde Prostitute in 1954. This is the core of my investigation. My slides show that the key event which indicate the ongoing interference and manipulation of Iraq's national and economic interest by Western hegemonic forces, I believe this has led to the development of a form of Iraqi Arabic free verse poetry that both reveals and critiques a problematic Duposian double consciousness as an expression of Iraqi identity. Through the lens of decolonization, read as a form of neo-colonization, as well as its idiosyncratic use of the Arabic language, As-Sayyab's poem, The Blind Prostitute, can be understood as expressing a form of Iraqi double consciousness in a way that critiques the tenuous bridges between the lingering invisibility of colonial powers and the neo-colonial nation of Iraq. The poem further reveals that this emergence of Iraqi double consciousness and national identity is deeply embedded within the effect of global capitalism that continue to subordinate the Iraqi nation and oppress the people of Iraq. Thus, As-Sayyab's poem not only brings awareness, but ultimately also works to incite resistance. Kevin Jones states that the prominent Iraqi poet of the time had a huge popularity among certain sections of the community, which included workers, students, and farmers, and indeed the poet's works was designed to appeal to all of them. The effect of this popularity of As-Sayyab's poem was to energize and to give voice to these classes, often collectively, for both political and social aims. Contrary to other critiques, I propose that As-Sayyab's poem is aligned with Iraq's identity as post-colonial nation. One can conclude that As-Sayyab's use of traditional themes, songs, and social values surfaces from his sense of double consciousness in which he sets his traditional knowledge of his culture within a Western framework. This shows how As-Sayyab's double literary inheritance, both Arabic language, Western framework, amount to Duposian double consciousness. As you can see from his quote in The Souls of Black Folks, Du Bois aimed to merge two positive identities, Black and American. Like As-Sayyab's double literary consciousness, he seeks the merging of striving in a positive way, which is Eastern and Western, or national and international, without the harmful description, contempt, and negation from the outside world. And now, at last, I can show you the poem itself. The Blind Prostitute tells the story of a young woman, Salima, forced into prostitution due to paternal neglect, and on his death, her economic disfranchisement, his plight is made even more desperate in that she is not only poor, but blind. The Blind Prostitute, as a national allegory, thus expresses double oppressions, but both internal and external, as the Iraqi nation found itself subjected to two oppressive powers. First, the British government, and secondly, the Hashemite monarchy. As Salima has lost her independence and had her rights torn from her, the Iraqi nation has also lost its own sovereignty and self-determination, viewing itself as born to be used by those who have the power to exploit it. In contrast to the seductive woman, As-Sayyab uses the allegorical figure of the prostitute as a symbol of social evil in order to express how prostitution is a matter of victimhood within an immoral system, as well as to contradict his culture's value to show how Iraq, through its reliance on traditional culture and colonial oppression, was complicit in such social evils. While the people who suffer are certainly within the scope of his concern, As-Sayyab's drawing attention to their condition was a call for reform without being explicit. The poem reinforces the notion that the prostitute is also an allegory for the nation that does not see or speak for itself. You sleep with a man, but there is no fruit but tears, and you eat, and your eyes are open all night, but you cannot see, and you cry out, but you have no lips. She sleeps with men, just as the Iraqi government and elites had oppressed the country with foreign powers. However, there is no natural product from this unholy liaison, only tears and humiliation. Nothing will come from this prostitution that will be able to sustain the country, even though she prostitutes herself because of hunger and poverty. Like the blind woman, the country of Iraq's eyes are open, but unable to see or make sense of anything concerning their relationship and conduct with the colonizer, and therefore the future of Iraq. As-Sayyab, in drawing the reader's attention to the injustice, supports argument arising from new Marxist literary theory that the foundation of the poem is a reaction to the social, economic, and political injustice inflicted upon the Iraqi people. Addressing her father, Salima cries, "Father, help me," but you will not listen to her cries. If you were just the blood and sweat to spray upon her forehead, and change her into a real woman and not just a commodity for sale, then you would have crowned her brow with glory and heroic deeds. The speaker of the poem places the blame on Salima's father. However, if he fights with his blood and sweat to protect her, then he will be proud of her with glory and heroic deeds. He has had opportunities to give her dignity. However, he chose not to because of his own misguided sense of what that honor meant. In other words, he prefers instead to have her resort to prostitution for the colonizer's economic gain. The poem then offers an even more severe criticism by comparing the beauty of Arab women to the economic attraction of Iraqi for the colonizers. O daughter of Arabs, like the dawn between grape arbors, like the surface of the Euphrates, reflecting the mildness of the earth and the rapacity of gold. In these lines, the poem extols the beauty of Arab women who are hard to resist, just as the rapacious colonizer cannot resist the attractiveness of the country they invade. In Iraq's case, it was the country, strategic geopolitical position, and abundance of oil deposit, the richness of the land, and the apparent ease with which it could be taken made it a prize too good to resist. This remembrance of her beauty contrasted with her current degradation suspend the figure of Salima as a metronome for the Iraqi nation, in a constant state of double consciousness, characterized by ongoing abuse for her colonizers. You drunks, I won't refuse any customer at all, except guests without money. I'm a flower of the swamp. I gulp mud and clay, and shine with the light of morning. Here the use of oxymoronic language illustrates Salima's double consciousness, as she is a flower, but of the swamp. She gulps mud and clay, as she now lives off the business of others. Nevertheless, Salima welcomes the defilement that they bring, thus revealing Iraq's willingness to defile itself by collaborating with the invader or colonizer for money. For these reasons, The Blind Prostitute can be understood as a poem that encapsulates a sense of a particularized double consciousness through its exploration of the economic relation between colonial powers and colonized nation of Iraq. Throughout the poem, As-Sayyab is making the following point: exceedingly clear, there is no way to dignify what the nation Salima's father has allowed the people in the care of Salima to become and forced them to endure. It is It is a disgrace, a stain on the whole nation that should not be tolerated or accepted. As-Sayyab not only raised awareness, but also called for resistance. This resistance is characterized with the prospect of salvation. Perhaps her dead father can intercede for her to God. In Islamic tradition, intercession can be made on a sinner's behalf by someone who is righteous. Could it be possible that her father could come to Salima's aid? One of the whispers or voices inside her explores this idea. Then you will cry out, Father, and he will shake the dust from his hand and hasten to you, shouting, I have come to you, Salima. Her father, indeed willing and keen to help his beloved daughter, he rushes to her aid, shouting to her to reassure her that help is coming. However, a bitter ironic disappointment is waiting. She has lost even her name, concealed by another, borrowed one. Ever since she became blind, she has been Sabah. What a bitter irony. The irony of this naming is that her father, speeding to her side, is looking for the pure, beloved, and honorable daughter that he used to know. But of course, there is no longer such a daughter there. He finds instead Sabah, the prostitute who has lived on honor, who now needs him. And there is there is a double irony. As Sabah in Arabic language means morning, dawn, or light, references that are all now completely inappropriate, as she is instead physically blind, living and working in the night. The poem also includes a song in which Salima dreams that if only there were some porter who would marry her, returning in the evening with bread in his left hand and love in his right, while he is singing songs describing wheat ears, girls, and flowers. This intricate use of imagery in a lyrical dream expresses her deepest desire to have a decent social life as a wife, but instead she is faced with a horror of being prostitute. According to Bulata, As-Sayyab sometimes wavered between hope and despair, the paradox between what Salima Sabah desired to be and what she really is expresses her sense of double consciousness as being trapped in a lived identity that she nevertheless hopes to escape. As-Sayyab calls for Iraqi citizens to turn away from Iraqi complicities with colonist oppression to a love and respect for the nation of Iraq and its people. A merging of this contradiction of double consciousness will in turn bring a sense of wholeness, decency, and economic integrity for the Iraqi nation. The poem thus beckons the Iraqi people to look to their future and resist new colonialism and global capitalist oppression in exchanging for decent life with an authentic sense of both individual and national self-identity.
"1845 was a year that saw a major shift to the social, economic, religious, and cultural landscape of the then British colony of Trinidad and Tobago. Slavery had been abolished in 1834. Thus, in order to amend the labour shortage and avoid ruin, planters looked to the Indian subcontinent to provide a cheap and abundant supply of workers. Thus commenced the indentureship scheme, which saw the creation of an Indian diaspora in the Caribbean, a system of imported labour that lasted until 1917. Historian Bridget Brereton explains the almost uniformly negative attitudes towards the new immigrants, referred to as Indians or Indo-Trinidadians in this paper. They entered the community only to occupy a menial social position as unfree and inferior beings. The fact that they now performed the roles previously done by the formerly enslaved meant that the majority of the population, unsurprisingly, looked down upon them. After indentureship ended, what resulted was a complex social landscape with tensions that remain, in some measure, to the present day. In the novel He Drowned She in the Sea, Trinidadian-Canadian writer Shani Mutu highlights the implications of race, class, and national belonging for her main characters. Dolly St. George and her son, Harry, are constructed and understood in light of the landscapes in which they are positioned and the place they are assigned in society. Dolly, an Indo-Trinidadian working-class woman who has little formal education, is in her own right a figure of strength and endurance. She is described as having fallen in love with a young fisherman, Theodath, who had been raised by an elderly Afro-Trinidadian couple, Tante Eugenie and Uncle Mako, in a fishing community. Through their secret meetings, Dolly becomes pregnant and is banished from her family home by her brother in a violent manner when he discovers what shame had befallen the family. The young couple marries, but Theodath meets an untimely death in a fishing accident. Mutu's portrayal of the widowed Dolly, living in a rural setting, reveals the difficulties of her life as an impoverished single parent, with all of its associated inconveniences and embarrassments. Her son, Harry, falls in love with his childhood friend, Rose, daughter of the wealthy Sangers, who employs his mother as a washerwoman. Yet he is quickly told his place by the gardener, who is also employed there. "You and she different, boy. That is Narayan Sanger daughter. You and me is yard boy material. She is the boss man daughter. Oil and water. Never the two shall mix." The narrative highlights the divisive nature of a society still reeling from the hierarchies of class and race constructed during colonial rule, and how these create constraints in their quest for personal belonging and happiness. Whereas the Afro-Indo-Trinidadian divide is often mentioned with respect to Trinidadian society, what is less discussed is the rural-urban divide. In the novel's 1930s setting, this not only represents a geographical division, but also an economic and class divide. With respect to Trinidad, on which the fictional island of Guanacaspar is modeled, the reality was of course more nuanced, with poor city dwellers as well as rich landowners in rural areas. Yet for reasons of simplicity, as well as for the creation of contrast, the novel presents binary divisions regarding this. In Guanacaspar, the urban areas are presented as being considerably more developed, with better infrastructure such as roads and housing, as well as amenities like electricity, water, sewage, along with transportation systems. Through the book's detailed descriptions of the rural setting, Mutu paints a comprehensive portrait of the struggles of life there in subtle ways, such as the inconveniences and isolation that result from limited mobility. Dolly's gender and ethnicity as a rural woman also restrict the options available to her. Victoria Paisley notes that during the time of slavery in Trinidad, slave owners found ways to reinforce gender inequalities despite ignoring these at times when it suited them. Therefore, while allowing men and women to work equally in the fields, only men were allowed access to artisanal skills, while the women were pushed into domestic spaces, doing the jobs of washerwomen or seamstresses in accordance with the European sexual division of labor. While Afro-Trinidadian men and women moved into these roles after the abolition of slavery, continuing the pattern of gender-specific work, after indentureship, Indian women had a different experience. Brenda Mehta notes that Indo-Caribbean women were confined to the privatization of the inside through the dictates of Hindu patriarchal demarcations of space. This, she notes, was a strategy to control Indian women within inhibiting familial paradigms by limiting their input to the functions of mother and homemaker. In Dolly's bid for work outside the home, she transgresses the usually imposed limitations of movement common to Indian women within that specific historical context. Furthermore, she has no blood relations to offer her provision and protection, having been driven away from home. Her husband's blood relations are also absent, being unknown, so the only family she has are the African Uncle Mako and Tante Eugenie. Since the Afro-Caribbean tradition sees the peasant woman as mothers, spouses, producers, and traders, it is natural that Dolly is expected to also work to provide for herself and Harry. For Afro-Caribbean women, the norm was never solely to stay at home and look after children, although this was an aspiration for middle-class women, whose model was colonial femininity. Yet Brenda Mehta reinforces Victoria Paisley's point with respect to the sexual division of labour, noting that this access to the labour force carried its own set of restrictions. The jobs that women could actually perform were rather limited in nature. As a woman, this naturally affects Dolly by narrowing her employment options to domestic work. Her position is further complicated and arguably made more difficult by the fact that independent work of this sort has been frowned upon by her ethnic community. Although this community, in the form of her childhood village as well as her family, has disowned her, their influence would still be present, and therefore even entering the city to find work necessitates the overcoming of ideological barriers. Sherry-Ann Singh notes that after indentureship ended, a reconfiguration of the Indian community took place, which focused on greater communal life. This included the insertion of the Ramayana, which is Hindu scriptures, in the Hindu wedding ceremony. Formerly, Singh notes, this was not as common during indentureship, perhaps due to the monogamous focus of the texts within a setting where male and female infidelity was prevalent. However, she notes that the emergence of Indian villages from the 1880s onwards stimulated a focus on community and family reconstitution and led to reconstruction of fragments of the traditional Hindu wedding ceremony. This facilitated the Ramayana's entrenchment in the Hindu psyche and its incursion into the ceremony and ideology of marriage. Eventually, the ceremony depicted in the Ramayana became the prime model. This was a result of the intense socio-religious activity of the first 3 decades after the end of Indian indenture, the markedly higher level of stability in conjugal relationships, which was then achieved, and wide subscription to the ideal of monogamy as advocated in the Ramayana. Singh further notes that the essential patriarchal family system that developed during the early post-indentureship period held a Sita, chaste, submissive, faithful and loyal to her husband, as the highest ideal of womanhood. Sita's dutiful example was also referenced as a deterrent to the snares of modernization and creolization for Indian women. However, the 1970s brought socio-economic change, which further led to changed perceptions, as Indo-Trinidadian women increasingly sought employment outside the confines of the home. Formerly, this was seen to transgress Hindu patriarchal demarcations of space and considered by the Hindu patriarchy to be a threat to women's chastity and domestic duty. Yet within this complex portrayal of social habits and strict notions of community life, Motu places the idea of valuing people based on their common humanity and not their ethnicity or economic worth as the core concepts that frame the social and emotional world of the novel. In a work very much concerned with ethnic and class distinctions, these are important points to get across, and Motu does so admirably. A seminal moment in the story is when the usually absent Mr. Sangha arrives home unexpectedly to find his little daughter Rose sleeping in the same bed with the young Harry. As an Indian man protective of his daughter's honor and furious by her close physical association with this working-class boy, he angrily asks, "What the arse is this?" His manner frightens Harry and Mr. Sangha forcefully removes his daughter from the bed. This ends Dolly's employment with the family, by her own doing, as is revealed later, and Harry's interactions with Rose, his best friend. After the incident, Dolly allows her son the space to throw a tantrum, understanding instinctively the rage he feels upon the realization of his difference, a difference that he did not choose and that his youth had previously prevented him from seeing. She assures him, however, that the Sanghas were no better than they, adding, "All of we cross black water, sometimes 6, sometimes 7 months, side by side in the same stinking boat to come here. Same, all of we. One set leaving something unsavory behind, another set looking for a fresh start. How, child, how out of those beginnings, some end up higher than others and some end up lower? Tell me this." Well, God alone know. We come here same time, same boat, same handling. They're not better than we, and that you should remember. Dolly refers back to the past of indentured labour to reveal a truth suppressed or ignored by some of those from our ethnic community who are currently in a better social/economic standing than others, that their history is the same, and it is a history that showed them all as equally lowly. Her reference to black water, the Kalapani, has its roots in a Hindu notion that crossing large bodies of water led to contamination and cultural defilement. Yet Brinda Mehta posits that this crossing and its associated transformative potential should be highlighted, not for the loss entailed, but rather for its emancipating power and the possibility of new identities. Thus, the novel presents the sea as a space in which barriers of caste, ethnicity, and class are broken down, a space which further connects both the formerly enslaved and formerly indentured, a common site of oppression, but now a site through which destinies continue to be forged. It is there that the Indian Siddharth and his adopted parents of African descent live as a family, despite the wider context of ethnic division in the national community. Unlike the indentured labourers who came before him, the sea becomes the site of great change and even opportunity for Harry, who relocates to Canada to escape class and ethnic tensions at home. There he creates a new life as a landscaper, a hint to one who is able to exert agency with respect to the land, as opposed to being strictly defined by its physical and ideological parameters. He further purchases a home by the seaside, connecting him to the fishing village of his childhood home. It is in Canada, where according to one character, the boundaries blur, that Harry reunites with his friend in love, Rose Sanger. In this new life, and separated from the sharp demarcations of class and ethnic tensions back home, they become lovers. It is fitting then that through the sea and the efforts of Harry's adopted grandparents, Rose and Harry can finally be together, despite the efforts of the former's wealthy and cruel husband. Uncle Maku, who feels the pull of the ocean and has longed to sail to Africa all his life, sees his dream in a sense partially realized by helping the young couple escape to Honduras for a new beginning. In this way, the sea once again becomes a site of change, transformation, and freedom. Val Plumwood explains that our capacity to gain insight from understanding our social context, to learn from self-critical perspectives on the past, and to allow for our own limitations of vision is still one of our best hopes for creative change and survival. For all the possibilities that the novel presents through the breaking of social conventions relating to bonds of kinship and love, it is nevertheless realistic in its portrayal of the forces that serve to disrupt these relations. As such, Shani Mutu crafts within her novel spaces of possibility, but not permanence, and in doing so, allows for her characters to find more tangible means of existence elsewhere. Rose and Harry, carried across the wide ocean, must bid farewell to their birthplace for love to thrive unfettered by ideological constraints. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Isabel, Rajbir, for your story engagement. It is really inspiring to see so many connections already being established today between your presentations and previous ones, and especially in regards to ethics of care on one hand and neglect on the other, which also came up in panel 1. And I can see powerful links between your presentations and what Professor Avtar Bra discussed in her keynote speech this morning about how diasporas are inherently intersectional and differentiated according to factors of gender, race, class, ethnicity, sexuality. And in your presentations, elements of intersectionality emerge strongly, but I was particularly struck by how a focus on identity and displacement brings forth important considerations regarding the roles of women and relationships to the land. And sometimes in discussions of women's roles as protectors or carers, issues are raised because of risks that while this paradigm of care can center and celebrate traditional women's roles, it may also close off their voices if they are relegated to a domestic and private space, sort of eclipsing contributions in the political and public sphere. So I wonder if you could all comment on this from the perspective of your work, and perhaps Rajbir could start. If you could talk a little about this is portrayed in the novel, if the women's role is celebrated or if it is problematized. And we have a few people in the chat asking about men's relation to culinary culture and the role of men in preserving Indian cultural identity, and whether it's possible for men to do so through food.
Yeah, thank you so much, Valentina, for the nice opening up this session. Yeah, so I would just like to begin with the statement that women are more often than not being presented as the flag bearers of a culture, especially when we're talking about Indian diaspora. They're more often talked of or portrayed as the flag bearer and protector of Indian culture through different cultural practices, and culinary being one of the central among them becomes a very both discursive and a productive side to do that, right? So they are made to do that, or they voluntarily do that. That depends on the context and the novels that we are talking about. But the novel that I have taken, it is presented as women are seamlessly, women do it on their own, how they want to evoke the Indian culture, Indianness, so we call it Indianness, through the culinary acts that they do in the diaspora, both at the home space and at the community space. Now talking about the role of men in Indian diaspora and how they are being represented. Yes, men do play a part in preserving Indian cultural identity. If I take one example, I can think of Floyd Cardoz, who is one of the famous chefs at the restaurant Tabla, and he is considered father of Indian cuisine, Indian modern cuisine. So in that way, through his culinary skills in the real life, he evokes Indianness, evokes Indian culturality, Indian cultural identity in the American context. So man does that, right? And he has also written one book, One Spice, Two Spice, American Food, Indian Flavors. So men do that quite a lot through the culinary through their culinary acts, through the books they write. But what happens, the politics of space is very important here, because men, when they cook, when they talk about cultural identity, when they produce cultural identity, they most often do in the public sphere, the public culture, outside home. Women are often wedded to the fact that women should be restricted within the quote-unquote private space that is home, and reproduce Indian cultural identity. So the context, that discussion diverges in this context, how space is being used and how the politics of space plays out in the Indian context, Indian diasporic context, right?
Thank you, Rajbir, for a very complex answers, and I'm just wondering if, because we have different contexts here in these panels today, and so moving from with this sort of focus, moving from your presentation and Victoria's, for example, I see that in your presentation you have foregrounded the ways in which women both inhabit and transgress those spaces that they are assigned to by patriarchal society. And I wonder, both for you and Rajbir as well, in this case, do the text represent tradition as static or as adaptive? And can it be, in other words, can it be reinvented or transformed for conveying more contemporary experiences?
Thank you for that question. So to even carry forth from what Rajbir said before, it's so interesting that you see that the space, the culinary skill for women, I find in a lot of these texts that I've studied as well within the Indian diaspora, is both a means of women enacting agency, but it's also a means of confinement. So there's that kind of dichotomy there. In one way, you see that women are able to exercise creative skill, but then you see that is a type of creative skill that's encouraged, of course, that is very much gendered, very much confined to the private realm. Within my text, for instance, we see that in the character of Dolly, who is a working class woman, whereas she is very much lauded as a very strong woman, a good mother. What we find out later in the text is that when she remarries, I didn't mention it in my presentation, but she does remarry. And what we find is that because she marries a businessman, she is able to help him take over the business, and in her own way has caused it to grow and expand so much. And what you find is that because she was never given the opportunities to exercise this kind of power, her son is so surprised. He said he didn't know that she was able, and she said, yes, I was always able. I always had a brain in my head. It's just that I was never given the opportunities to use it. And I think so often in these texts we put the women are portrayed as being rewarded for inhabiting this space of domesticity, that is where they find most of their rewards, at least within the familial context. But of course, the space in the national context is often disregarded. And because it's disregarded, they themselves come to be disregarded as well in that wider context. So for a lot of women within the Indian diaspora, well, some, I can't say all, you find that is where, within the domestic spaces, where they're able to find a sense of meaning, but is a kind of like a no-win, because that space itself refuses them entry to the outside world in terms of that. So you do see that in my text, we have this character who is forced to transgress this domestic space simply because she is married into a family with her deceased husband, an Afro-Caribbean family where the tradition is go out and work. So she has her own sense of what an Indian woman should do. You should be confined to the domestic realm, but then you're in another culture which says, well, it's you alone, you have to go out and work. And because she transgresses the space, we find that she's able to thrive in that space as well, and we're able to see her function in a way that you would not have seen her before. So I thought that was...
Thank you. Thanks. Yes, so much to think about in terms of the experiences you're just discussing right now. And I wonder if, because I think, Isabel, in your abstract, I think you also mentioned women's role and how they're both part of citizenship, but also always at the margins. Could you talk a little bit more about that?
Yeah, sure. I think it's important to remember that women were never supposed to be included in citizenship, so they never really had a place in the structure itself. So when you include a woman into, and obviously I'm talking cis women because LGBT rights weren't even a thing to begin with, so that's a completely different discussion. But when we talk about cis women, they were never supposed to be part of the structure. So when you add a woman into the citizen structure, all you do is just really, the system just views her as another man, which obviously causes a lot of difficulties when it comes to statistics and when it comes to actually implementing laws and stuff, because you're not counting a woman, you're counting just more men. So I didn't include them, therefore, in the alienated structure, because they're not included in the alien concept at all, really. They're part there to still be their productive structure of the system that can actually give more citizens to that same system, but they're not really counted as full human in that system. So I think there are ways in which that has still been used in order to get refugee status and have special characteristics being actually included women into it. But the very fact that you have to kind of make a different clause altogether to get women's rights into human rights and to get women actually recognized into refugeedom through special characteristics already kind of makes you think that they've not been included from the beginning as fully human. So there's a lot to unpack there, but yeah, I'm not specializing necessarily in women's experiences, but obviously trying to tease out who is and who is not a citizen in the eyes of the law and how it was developed. Obviously, that was very easily discoverable, that if you then have to wait several decades to even get a clause for women, that means that they were never included to begin with.
No, thanks so much for saying this. I know you didn't tackle this on your presentation, but I could feel that it was like a subtext in a way somewhere there. And also, Ghosun, in your presentation as well, you don't exactly address women's issues, but we see how a particular depiction of a woman is used as an allegory to discuss the troubles inflicted on the land and the Iraqi nation. I was wondering if you see any issues perhaps with a male author representing raped land as a woman who is silenced and blind, or does she have any agency in the poem? And perhaps if you can provide maybe other examples of like how women authors maybe tackle such issues.
Well, actually, for my poem, The Blind Prostitute, Sayab expresses as a national allegory, and this embodied is not familiar in Arabic literature at that time. So, for example, Derwish, it's a Palestinian writer. He represents the nation as a sister, or as a mother, or as a beloved, while you can find the Sayyab here represent his nation as a prostitute. So the reason that I think, just to grab attention about the neo-colonial issue at that time. So السياب is not he didn't depict Salima, the main character at the point, as a prostitute in a bad way. Yeah, he just would like to show how she was a victim. So despite her oppression and humiliation, Salima makes desperate effort to uphold her dignity. The poem progression provides a critical interpretation of the inner battle and conflict, and she undergoes existing in a world of corruption, poverty, and national or foreign exploitation and colonization. So I think all of this, until to deliver a message that until today, while Iraq no officially colonized, the Iraqi experience for personal or national identity are still influenced by vestiges of colonialism as neo-colonialism. And I think this is the message that Sayyab would like to deliver.
Thank you. Yes, I would like to then pass on some of the questions that were submitted in the chat. So I have a question for Isabel, and it's Beth. She asks if you could recommend any literary, cultural, or any other type of popular text that depicts or deals with alienhoods outside of the US context.
That's a really good question, because I think outside of the US, I don't think it's called alienhood. But I think it's a problem in of itself, because I think alienhood is a very conscious process of the state. So like alienhood is what also demarcates the nation. So like it's a very specific process trying to alienate very specific people, right? So when you talk about diaspora, when you talk about people feeling excluded, marginalized from the nation, you're talking about alienhoods being created. So spaces being created that are excluded from the national imagining. So I would say, even though it's not been named alienhoods, there are lots of processes that have been written about that are alienhoods. I would also say there's a very socio-legal term in Britain. So I would also look at how it's been used to militarize certain nations. So the eastern parts of Europe, for example, how it completely got rid of its Arab identities. Same with like the southern parts of Europe, it also got rid of its Arab identities, how those identities are also vilified and therefore create alienhoods for people who are already inside the country and are Arab, for example. But also how it erases the like indigenous people of Northern Europe, for example, that we never talk about because they don't exist in our imaginings. They're complete areas of alienhood because we don't even think about them as existing. So all these different stories would still count into alienhoods. They're just not named as such yet because we just assume that that's a US thing, but actually in our legal system, that is where it comes from, and that's where alien comes from. So I would say there's a lot of literature and they probably already have read them. They just haven't called them alienhoods. So if you read things like Ansaldo's Borderlands, even if it's Latin America with the US at that point, like that would also be a form of alienhood. So anything that has to do with diaspora and very targeted populations, I would say, is alienhoods.
Thanks very much. Yeah, I think what you're saying is also about the labeling and how sometimes with specific labels we might not think outside of some fixed parameters. But yeah, this was really interesting. Thank you. I have another question for Ghosun. So Shirin asks, it is known that the theory of double consciousness is about race. Can you briefly explain how it fits in Iraqi Arabic context?
Yeah, it's an interesting question, actually, and this is the core of my investigation. So I'm working on my PhD thesis in order to answer this question. So I would like to give her like a simple and brief answer. W.B. Du Bois is giving us a very rich language for talking about a certain kind of doublenesses. So it's a doublenesses in a context of African American culture, and some way it speaks to Iraqi experience, but in another way it's very different from Iraqi experience. So I can say they are similar but not identical. And in order to approach this in a Du Boisian way, is to think about the profound sense of personal is a divided identity. So, Du Bois' ideas that the African American, they are simultaneously African and American. The dominant culture is a white American culture. So to be American, but also to be Black, is to be divided between how you see yourself, and how the dominant culture sees you. And that a little different in Iraq, of course, because the mainstream culture is Iraqi Arabic culture, but it also historically that culture has been colonized and has been controlled by outside Western power. So, Iraqi Arab has to see himself as a member of majority culture, but also as a colonized subject at the same time. So, Iraqi person can say that I'm an Arab and I'm a native of this land, but also a subject to a British Empire. And this is a kind of double consciousness, the divided identity that I'm focusing on the Arabic context or Arabic Iraqi context.
Thank you, Ghosun. This is a very interesting topic, and I feel like you are in the process of exploring this. So yeah, but it sounds like you know where you're going with it. So thank you for your answer. And I have another question from the chat. I have two questions for Rajbir. So Beth asks, do you think the relationship between food and homeland has been exoticized in the Indian context?
Yeah. So to answer it more bluntly, I would say that there has been a spate of novels and films that has quite remarkably associated Indian identity and Indian food in a number of ways, right? So what the novels that I can think of, the novels like The Mistress of Spices, Jasmine Bharti Kitchener's Pastries, a novel of desserts and pastries, they quite redundantly, I would say, they quite redundantly speak of food and Indian. And but if I speak specifically of the novel The Mistress of Spices by Chitra Banerjee, it was entirely, the food, Indian food is entirely portrayed from an Orientalist point of view. So it is utterly being presented from an Orientalist point of view and highly exoticized. But there are chances, there are sites where you can discursively associate, engage yourself with the food that the writers use, like Anita Manner does, Mira Sahal does in her novel, or like in the namesake, the writer does so. You can do so from very discursive point of view. Though the number of those kind of novels are quite less, but yes, there are certainly novels which both exoticize Indian food, but also engage from discursive point of view.
Thank you. I think what you've just said links well with the next question, which is also for you, and it's from Purna, because what you were saying about exoticization also made me think of the notion of authenticity. And so Purna asks, he says, Indian culinary practices can be hugely diverse, and what is cooked and consumed as authentic Indian food by the diasporic community is also a matter of contestation. While you did mention roti and rice, meat remains a somewhat generic term. Is there any indication as to what meat the communities consume? Also, given the right-wing government's hyper and violent vegetarianism in India, now, to what extent consuming the authentic Indian food by the diasporic communities might overlap with a nostalgia for the hegemonic Hindu identity? This is a very complex question.
Yeah, that's a very long and very layered question, I would say that. Yeah, first, in terms of the first part of the question, whether it is being it is being categorically said what kind of food, what kind of meat is being eaten. No, there is not any specific term or specific kind of meat that is being portrayed in the novel. It was only written as meat. Yeah, so I would like to say one thing, that the authenticity that we are talking about here is very, I would say, superfluous in its own term, right? When you are talking of Indian food, quote unquote Indian food, it is quite problematic. It is also problematic and also very polemical in its own way, right? And speaking of how diaspora approaches food, how diaspora approaches the food of the homeland. If I take one example from Sahani Muttu's short story Susila's Bhakti, right? So in that short story, what happens is that Susila's grandmother is a Hindu woman, and she tries on to pass on the Hindu ritual norms, Hindu cultural practices, right? So but in one of her dietary practices, she forgets what is the dietary division between Hindus and Muslims that separate them. So we cannot know that whether it is a deliberate or indeliberate attempt on her part to forget that, right? So food is very political in its own way, right? So speaking about the second part of the question, the right-wing government's hyper and violent vegetarianism in India and how it is connected to Indian diaspora, there is not such any novel that talks about it, but if I find one, I will certainly comment on that, right? Thank you.
Thank you. So as we move towards the end of this panel, to wrap things up, I was just thinking that you all have established connections between different ideas, practices, and histories, but also you suggested that there are some disconnections and barriers in understanding and in the lived experiences of diasporic peoples. I was wondering if you could all talk a little bit, just to close up, about the kinds of bridges that you are committed to building through your research, and what are the difficulties that you may encounter in performing your research. Victoria, would you like to start?
Okay, sure. A crucial part of my research, when I examined my novels, I found that a lot of the fictional identities being explored were shaped in some way through this sense of communal shame. I found that was a recurring theme within many of the books, that you saw that whether it was through some relative passing down trauma, I saw that shame was an essential aspect of it. And one thing that I would like to bring about my research is that just this idea of the pervasive power of shame, but also the fact that by opening up an identity to other influences, particularly in the Caribbean, where there are so many, we have such. I spent 2 months in Ghana last year, and I realized I am just as much influenced by West Africa as I am India. After being in Ghana, it felt like home, which was quite a shock. I didn't expect it. So part of it was that it is to see that through this archive of creative identities that we have in these novels, that you realize that there's a range of accessible identities to women, and that you don't have to constrict yourself to what is culturally acceptable or not, but that through the possibilities of diaspora and also globalization and other forms of exposure, that hopefully women will be able to, to see that there are different possibilities available to them to enact selfhood.
Thank you. That was really a very beautifully put. I was really interested in what you were saying about shame as well. It's a very powerful trope, I think. Yeah, I look forward to more of your research. Yes, Ghosun, would you like to pick up on that in terms of like kinds of bridges that you're committed to building and maybe difficulties that you may encounter?
Actually, the Iraqi history, it has a lot of complexity. So as I'm not focusing on one period of time, so I'm focusing on like 40s and 60s and 70s until today. I'm trying to prove the ongoing new colonization. So through the lens of decolonization and as a result of new colonization, so that there is a many different can I say like tenuous bridges between the idiosyncratic use of Arabic language, the expression of national and identity, and the lingering invisibility of colonial power and new colonial nation of Iraq. And the most difficult is that I'm countering that is the poem itself is not translated, and I'm translating it by myself, most of it, not all of it. So by working with Arabic and English as a bilingual student, so this maybe can make make me be aware in a way of the critiques that between new colonialism and the colonial power in Iraqi context.
Thank you. Rajbir?
Yes. So speaking of this conference, only when I talked about when I went through all the when all the presentations, what I found is specifically in Victoria's presentation, how diaspora is highly a gendered place, and the rules of gender, like Hindu patriarchal dictates, has been transposed to different countries outside of the national boundaries, that is India, right? So how the dictates are being the same, and that is being employed through and over again in the diaspora in different countries, and the very space of home is being used both as to like foster Indian identity and also to inhibit Indian women, right? So I can connect Victoria's presentation very much, and also Ghosun's presentation in terms of how double consciousness is being used, how the colonial strategies are being used, and how colonialism is the very basis of the creation of diaspora, right? Yeah.
Thank you. We've lost Isabel, but I really appreciate all of your efforts, including Isabel's, and in the discussion and in the presentation. This was a really lovely discussion. And so this is the last panel for today, but the conference will continue tomorrow, and it will open with a wonderful keynote speech by Dr. Sophie Chow. So I hope to see you all tomorrow and in the next few days. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you so much. I really enjoyed this time. Thank you.
Me too. Thank you. It feels, are we off, Joshua?